London, 1863. The gold and crimson drawing room of Lady Havisham's grand home buzzed with the familiar symphony of high society, genteel laughter, the clink of fine china, and most importantly, whispers. The season was nearing its apex, and the whispers had reached a crescendo concerning one particular gentleman. "They say he must sell Thornfield within the month," murmured a woman behind her fan to her companion. "The Earl of Fairmorn, entirely ruined. His father's gambling debts have finally come due." "Such a shame," her friend replied. "Such a handsome man to be brought so low. They say he's hunting an heiress with desperation." Across the room, the subject of their gossip stood tall by the mantelpiece, seemingly oblivious to the speculation that swirled around him like smoke. Alexander Fairmorn, the 7th Earl of Fairmorn, maintained the perfect posture and pleasant expression expected of his station, though his dark eyes betrayed a shadow of something heavier. At 32, he possessed the kind of aristocratic features that improved with maturity: strong jaw, aquiline nose, and a brow that suggested both intellect and intensity. Fairmorn, called Lord Pembroke, approaching with 2 glasses of brandy. "You're looking positively funereal tonight. Here, this should help." Alexander accepted the glass with a small, tight smile. "Thank you, Pembroke. Just tired of the same conversations." "And which conversations would those be? The weather, the Queen's health, or your impending financial collapse?" Pembroke's smile was meant to soften the blow, but Alexander's jaw tightened nonetheless. "News travels quickly. It always does when it's unfortunate." Pembroke lowered his voice. "Is it true? Thornfield is at risk?" Alexander took a measured sip before answering. 3 generations of poor investments and my father's final, disastrous railway venture have left me with few options. I have until the end of the month to settle with the creditors." "And have you considered the obvious solution? Half the débutantes here have dowries that could save Thornfield twice over." "I'm well aware," Alexander replied dryly. "Their mothers have been making that abundantly clear." "Well then, what about—" Pembroke's suggestion was cut short as the drawing-room doors opened and a latecomer arrived. She was not what society would typically consider a great beauty. Her dress, though well-made, lacked the excessive ornamentation favored that season, and her honey-brown hair was arranged simply. Yet there was something in her confident stride and the intelligence in her hazel eyes that drew attention. Several heads turned, and the whispering changed its course. "Miss Hope Winslow," the butler announced. "And Mrs. Margaret Winslow." Alexander watched as the young woman and her aunt, for it was well known that Hope Winslow had been orphaned some years ago, were greeted by Lady Havisham. He had encountered Miss Winslow only in passing at previous events, knowing merely that she was the niece and ward of the wealthy shipping merchant James Winslow, who had died the previous year, leaving her with a considerable fortune and under the guardianship of her aunt until her 25th birthday. "Now there," Pembroke said softly, "is a solution with £30,000 attached to it, if the rumours are correct." Alexander frowned. "I'm not so desperate as to pursue a woman for her money alone." "Aren't you, though?" Pembroke challenged. "What will you do if Thornfield is lost? Where will your tenants go? What of your sister's futures? Pride is a luxury you can no longer afford, my friend." Alexander stared into his brandy, the amber liquid reflecting the candlelight much as his family's legacy had once shone, before being dimmed by generations of mismanagement culminating in his father's final, catastrophic gambles. "Besides," Pembroke continued, "Miss Winslow is hardly a hardship to look at, and they say she's quite clever. Better her than old Featherington's daughter, who has a face like a horse and the personality to match." "Your assessment of the marriage market is as delicate as ever," Alexander replied, but his gaze followed Miss Winslow as she moved through the room, stopping to speak with an elderly woman whom others had notably avoided. He watched her bend to listen attentively to the old woman, whose gnarled hands gestured with animation. Miss Winslow's smile was warm, genuine, not the practiced social expression he had grown accustomed to seeing on the faces of society's young ladies. "I see I've piqued your interest," Pembroke observed. Alexander drained his glass. "You've made your point about my situation. That doesn't mean I'm ready to throw myself at the feet of the first heiress I see." "Well, you'd better become ready soon. The vultures are circling Thornfield, and time is not your ally. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself, almost without conscious intention, drawing nearer to Miss Winslow's orbit. When Lady Havisham announced that music would follow dinner, he positioned himself where he might observe both the performers and Miss Winslow's reactions. He was surprised when Lady Havisham called upon Miss Winslow herself to play. She approached the pianoforte with neither false modesty nor overwhelming confidence, simply the air of someone who knew her abilities and was comfortable with them. Her performance was like her appearance, not the most technically brilliant of the evening, but possessing a warmth and expression that the more accomplished but mechanical players had lacked. When she finished, the applause was genuine, and Alexander found himself joining with unexpected enthusiasm. Later, as guests circulated with tea, he deliberately intercepted her path. "Miss Winslow," he said with a bow. "Your performance was most affecting." She looked up at him with those clear hazel eyes, and he was struck by the directness of her gaze, uncommon among young ladies trained to deploy strategic glances. "Lord Fairmorn," she replied with a proper curtsy. "You're very kind, though I suspect you've heard far superior musicians." "Technical superiority isn't everything," he said. "You played with feeling." A slight flush colored her cheeks. "Music should be felt, not merely executed, don't you think?" "I do indeed. Though I confess I've never had much talent for it myself." "And what talents do you possess, my lord?" she asked, then immediately looked slightly embarrassed by her forthrightness. Rather than being offended, Alexander found himself unexpectedly charmed. "Horsemanship, land management, and a particularly good memory for faces and names, all the proper aristocratic skills," he answered with a self-deprecating smile. "Nothing so soul-stirring as music." "I think there's great soul in caring well for land and those who live on it," she replied seriously. Something in her tone made Alexander wonder if she knew about Thornfield's troubles, but before he could determine a way to investigate this possibility, Mrs. Margaret Winslow appeared at her niece's side. "Hope, dear, Lady Havisham was just asking after your charitable work with the orphanage," her aunt said, then nodded politely to Alexander. "Lord Fairmorn." "Mrs. Winslow," he responded with a bow. "I was just complimenting your niece on her musical performance." "Yes, my brother insisted on the finest tutors," Mrs. Winslow said. Though Hope has always been more interested in her charitable pursuits than in the accomplishments designed to secure a husband. "Aunt," Hope murmured in gentle protest. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Orphanages, Miss Winslow? That's not the typical charitable focus for young ladies of society." Something changed in her expression, a shadow of old pain quickly masked. "Having lost my parents at a young age, I understand the particular challenges such children face, even if my own circumstances were far more fortunate." The simple statement, delivered without bid for sympathy, struck Alexander more powerfully than any of the carefully practiced tragic expressions he'd received from other young ladies attempting to engage his interest. "A worthy cause," he said genuinely. "I should like to hear more about it sometime." "Perhaps at Lady Pemberton's garden party next week," her aunt suggested with the smooth skill of a woman well versed in social maneuvering. "I believe we are all invited." Alexander inclined his head. "I look forward to it." As the Winslow ladies moved on, Alexander caught Pembroke's knowing look from across the room. His friend raised his glass in silent toast, and Alexander suppressed a sigh. The thought of courting a woman for her fortune left a sour taste in his mouth, yet Pembroke's earlier words echoed in his mind. What of his tenants, his sisters, the generations of Fairmonts who had called Thornfield home? Miss Winslow's fortune could indeed save Thornfield. And if she must be pursued for that purpose, at least she seemed a woman of substance rather than merely substantial wealth. He would attend Lady Pemberton's garden party and discover whether Miss Hope Winslow might be the solution to the crisis that threatened everything he held dear. The week that followed brought a letter that turned Alexander's concern to genuine alarm. His primary creditor, Mr. Harrington, had sold the debt to another party, one who declined to extend the deadline for repayment. Alexander's solicitor reported that this mysterious buyer seemed determined to force the sale of Thornfield, rather than negotiate terms. By the time Lady Pemberton's garden party arrived, Alexander had moved beyond reluctance to determination. His ancestral home, and the livelihoods of all who depended upon it, now hung by the thinnest of threads. The garden party presented the perfect opportunity for his purpose. The sprawling grounds of Pemberton Hall allowed for walks away from the immediate scrutiny of the gossips, while still maintaining proper visibility and decorum. He spotted Hope shortly after arriving. She wore a day dress of periwinkle blue that complemented her complexion, and she was engaged in conversation with the vicar's wife near a display of prize roses. Approaching with practiced ease, Alexander greeted both ladies before asking, "Miss Winslow, I was wondering if you might allow me to show you Lady Pemberton's remarkable orangery. I understand you have an interest in botanical specimens." Hope looked surprised but pleased. "I do indeed, though I wonder how you came by that information, my lord." Lady Havisham mentioned your knowledge of medicinal plants. He improvised smoothly, having heard nothing of the sort but suspecting that a woman with interest in practical charity might also have such knowledge. Her smile confirmed his lucky guess. "Then I would be delighted to see the orangery." With Mrs. Pemberton's wife providing the necessary approval with a knowing smile, they set off down one of the garden paths, maintaining a proper distance but close enough for conversation. "You've caused quite a stir today, Lord Fairmorn," Hope remarked as they walked. "Have I?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "Indeed. The Earl of Fairmorn singling out the merchant's niece for a private tour has set tongues wagging most energetically." Alexander felt a flash of guilt. "I apologize if I've made you the subject of gossip." "Oh, I'm quite used to being gossiped about," she replied with surprising lightness. When one is a wealthy orphan raised by a shipping merchant rather than proper gentry, one becomes accustomed to scrutiny. Her frankness was refreshing. "And does the gossip trouble you?" "Only when it's cruel rather than merely curious." She paused to examine a particularly vibrant rose. "People will always talk. I learned long ago that I cannot control their words, only my reaction to them." They continued walking, and Alexander found himself genuinely interested in her perspective. "That's a remarkably philosophical view for one so young." "I'm 23, my lord, not a child," she replied with a hint of amusement. "And life has provided ample opportunity to develop such philosophy." "Of course," he conceded. "I meant no offense." "None taken. But now that we've established I'm capable of adult conversation, perhaps you might tell me the real reason for this private tour." Alexander nearly missed a step. He glanced at her face and found her watching him with those clear, direct eyes that seemed to see through polite pretense. "What makes you think there's a reason beyond admiring botanical specimens?" he asked, buying time to recalibrate. Hope's smile was gentle but knowing. "Because you've attended 3 events where I was present in the past year and have never before sought my company. Because Lady Havisham, while a lovely woman, has never discussed my interest in medicinal plants with anyone. And because the financial troubles of Thornfield have become common knowledge, as has my inheritance." Alexander felt heat rise to his face. He had underestimated her considerably. "You are remarkably direct, Miss Winslow." "I value honest speech," she replied simply. "My uncle taught me that clarity prevents misunderstandings in both business and personal matters." They had reached the orangery, a magnificent glass structure housing exotic plants from throughout the empire. Alexander held the door for her, acutely aware that this conversation had veered wildly from his carefully planned approach. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant with citrus blossoms. They were alone among the potted trees and flowering vines, though still visible through the glass walls to anyone who might glance their way. "Very well," Alexander said, deciding that her honesty deserved equal candor. "You're right on all counts. Thornfield is in grave financial danger due to my father's debts, which I inherited along with the title. And yes, I had thought to begin paying court to you, knowing your situation." Instead of the offense he half expected, Hope simply nodded. "Thank you for your honesty. May I ask how dire the situation is?" "I have less than 3 weeks to raise an impossible sum, or Thornfield and all its lands will be sold to satisfy the creditors," he admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. "And the estate itself, is it mismanaged?" Would it be able to recover and thrive with the debts cleared? The question surprised him. It was precisely the sort of practical inquiry his own solicitor had posed, not the romantic or social concerns he had expected from a young lady. The land is sound and productive, he answered. The tenants are hard-working, and the steward capable. It's merely the accumulated debt that threatens us. Hope considered this, walking slowly among the orange trees. And if you were to secure the funds needed, through marriage or other means, what then? Would you continue as before, or make changes to prevent such a situation from arising again? Alexander had not anticipated such an interview when planning his courtship strategy. Yet he found himself appreciating her directness, which allowed them to bypass weeks of delicate social maneuvering. I've already implemented significant changes in estate management, he said. I've reduced household expenses, sold properties that weren't entailed, and invested in agricultural improvements to increase yield. The issue isn't ongoing mismanagement, but rather the overwhelming burden of past mistakes. She nodded thoughtfully. And the purpose of this walk was to determine whether I might be amenable to a marital arrangement that would save Thornfield. Put so baldly, his intention sounded mercenary indeed. That was my initial thought, he admitted, uncomfortable but committed to honesty now. Though I would not have been so direct as you've been. To his surprise, Hope laughed, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to brighten the already sun-filled orangery. No, I imagine you would have been much more proper and taken weeks to reach the point. You're not offended, he asked, bewildered by her reaction. Should I be? You wouldn't be the first man to consider me for my inheritance rather than myself. At least you're honest about it when pressed. She touched a leaf gently. But courtship, my lord, traditionally involves learning about the person one intends to marry. You've told me about Thornfield's plight, but you've asked nothing about me, my interests, or what I might want in a husband. The gentle rebuke was entirely justified. You're right, of course. I've been consumed by Thornfield's troubles and have approached this all wrong. Not all wrong, she corrected. Your concern for your estate and its people is admirable. Many in your position would simply abandon their responsibilities and flee to the continent. They had completed a circuit of the orangery and now stood near the entrance again. Alexander found himself reluctant to end the conversation, despite how differently it had proceeded from his expectations. Miss Winslow, may I be permitted to start again? Not with financial discussions, but with a genuine desire to know you better. Her expression softened. I would like that, Lord Fairmorn. Would you do me the honor of saving a dance for me at the Millbrook Ball tomorrow evening? I will. She regarded him thoughtfully. And perhaps you might call at my aunt's home one afternoon next week? She hosts a small gathering on Thursdays. I would be delighted, he replied, surprised by how truly he meant it. As they made their way back to the main party, Alexander found himself contemplating the unexpected turn of events. He had sought out Hope Winslow for her fortune, yet her intelligence and forthright manner had caught his interest in a way he hadn't anticipated. Whether or not she might eventually be the salvation of Thornfield remained to be seen, but he was now genuinely curious about the woman herself. The gossips watched their return with avid interest, and Alexander knew that speculation would run rampant by evening. For once, he found himself unconcerned with society's whispers. He had a more intriguing puzzle to consider, the forthright heiress with the clear gaze who had seen through his careful approach and challenged him to genuine conversation instead. The Millbrook Ball the following evening found Alexander scanning the crowded ballroom for a periwinkle blue dress. When he finally spotted Hope, however, she wore deep green velvet that complemented her honey-brown hair and fair skin. She was conversing with his younger sister, Elizabeth, which gave him momentary pause. He hadn't mentioned his sister's presence at the ball to Hope. As he approached, Elizabeth's laughter at something Hope had said made him smile. His sister's happiness had been in short supply since their father's death and the subsequent financial revelations. Lord Fairmorn, Hope greeted him with a proper curtsy, though her eyes held a warmth that went beyond mere social politeness. Miss Winslow. I see you've met my sister. Indeed, and what a pleasure it has been, Hope replied. Miss Elizabeth has been telling me about her watercolors. Elizabeth, just 18 and in her first season, beamed. Miss Winslow has invited me to view her aunt's collection of botanical illustrations. Some date back to the previous century. Alexander raised an eyebrow. You're interested in botanical illustrations, Miss Winslow? I thought your passion was for the living plants themselves. One can appreciate both the subject and its artistic representation, surely. Hope replied. And your sister has a remarkable talent. She described her painting of Thornfield's rose garden so vividly I could almost smell the blooms. Elizabeth blushed with pleasure. You're too kind, Miss Winslow. Not at all. I hope you'll show me your work sometime. A young viscount approached to claim Elizabeth for a dance, leaving Alexander and Hope momentarily alone amidst the crowded room. That was kind of you, Alexander said. Elizabeth's confidence has suffered lately with all our financial uncertainty. It wasn't mere kindness. Your sister has a genuine gift, from what she described. Hope's gaze followed Elizabeth to the dance floor. She mentioned that she fears having to give up her art supplies due to economy measures. Alexander felt a pang of guilt. Unfortunately, luxuries must be sacrificed in our current situation. Art is not a luxury, Lord Fairmorn, Hope replied with unexpected intensity. It's sustenance for the soul. Particularly for a young woman with limited acceptable outlets for her energies and talents. Before he could respond, the orchestra began the opening notes of a waltz, the dance for which Hope had promised him her hand. He offered his arm, and she placed her gloved hand upon it. As they took their positions on the dance floor, Alexander was acutely aware of the attention they drew. The impoverished Earl and the wealthy merchant's niece, gossip would be rampant by morning. You dance well, he remarked as they moved through the steps. My uncle insisted I learn all the social graces, despite having no personal interest in them himself, she replied. He said that while he had made his fortune without societal acceptance, my path would be smoother with it. He sounds like a wise man. The wisest I've known, she said with genuine affection. He took me in after my parents died of fever when I was 10. I had no claim on him beyond being his brother's child, yet he raised me as his own and made me his heir despite the scandal it caused among his business associates. Scandal? Alexander asked, curious. Many felt he should have chosen a male heir for his shipping company, a nephew from his wife's family, or even a trusted employee. Instead, he taught me the business from the time I was 12, taking me to the docks, teaching me to read ledgers and manifests, even allowing me to sit in on negotiations when I was older. Her eyes shone with pride and remembrance. By the time he died, I knew every aspect of Winslow shipping. That's remarkable, Alexander said, genuinely impressed. Few men would consider a niece for such a role. My uncle saw people for their abilities, not their gender or birth. The music swelled as they turned, her skirts brushing against his legs. He would have appreciated your concern for your tenants and estate workers. Wealth brings responsibility, he always said. A philosophy I share, though my ability to fulfill that responsibility is currently in jeopardy. Hope studied his face as they moved through the steps of the waltz. Have you explored all possible solutions to your financial troubles? Every one I can think of, he admitted. I've sold what isn't entailed, cut expenses to the bone, even approached the bank for loans using future harvests as collateral. But the debts my father accumulated are simply too substantial. And the creditor who holds the largest portion, the one who refuses to negotiate, do you know who it is? Alexander's brow furrowed. My solicitor has been unable to discover their identity. They operate through an agent who remains frustratingly tight-lipped. How curious, Hope murmured, her expression thoughtful. The waltz ended, and Alexander reluctantly released her hand. As he escorted her back to her aunt, he found himself wishing for more time in her company, not because of her fortune, but because her conversation intrigued him. I look forward to Thursday, he said as they reached Mrs. Winslow. As do I, Lord Fairmorn, Hope replied with a smile that stayed with him long after he had moved on to fulfill his other social obligations for the evening. Later, as his carriage carried him and Elizabeth home, his sister broke a companionable silence. "I like Miss Winslow." "Do you?" he replied, trying to sound merely polite rather than overly interested. "Very much. She's not like the other society girls, all pretense and competition. She asked genuine questions about my painting and actually listened to the answers." Elizabeth hesitated. "And she didn't treat me differently when I mentioned our financial troubles." Alexander's head snapped up. "You told her about our situation?" "She already knew, Alexander. Everyone knows." Elizabeth's voice held a touch of exasperation. But unlike most, she didn't offer pity or veiled gloating. She spoke of it practically, asking if I had considered offering painting lessons to supplement our income. "Painting lessons?" he echoed, surprised. "She says many society mothers would pay handsomely for an Earl's sister to teach their daughters, without the stigma of employing a common drawing master." Elizabeth's eyes brightened. "It's a brilliant idea, really. I could earn enough to pay for my own art supplies at least, and perhaps contribute something to the household." Alexander was struck by the practicality of the suggestion, and by the way it preserved his sister's dignity while acknowledging their new reality. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful solution that came from understanding both society's rules and the need to work within them. "Miss Winslow seems to have made quite an impression on you," he observed. Elizabeth gave him a knowing look. "On both of us, I think." Alexander couldn't deny it, though the realization was unexpected. He had approached Hope Winslow with calculated intent, yet found himself genuinely drawn to her character. The fortune that had initially attracted his attention now seemed almost incidental to the woman herself. As the carriage rolled through London's darkened streets, he contemplated the Thursday gathering at Mrs. Winslow's home with anticipation that had nothing to do with financial salvation and everything to do with spending more time in the company of a woman who continued to surprise him. Thursday arrived with unexpected complications. A letter from Alexander's solicitor brought news that the mysterious creditor had accelerated their timeline, demanding payment within 10 days rather than the originally stated 3 weeks. The solicitor's tone suggested that this buyer was not merely seeking financial return but had some specific interest in acquiring Thornfield itself. With this troubling development weighing on his mind, Alexander arrived at Mrs. Winslow's elegant townhouse in Belgravia. The gathering was smaller and less formal than he had anticipated, just a dozen guests engaged in comfortable conversation in a well-appointed drawing room. Hope greeted him warmly, dressed simply but elegantly in a day dress of soft blue. "Lord Fairmorn, I'm so pleased you could join us. My aunt's Thursday gatherings are something of a refuge from the more formal social calendar." "I can see why," he replied, taking in the relaxed atmosphere. "Though I confess I'm surprised by the diverse company." Indeed, the guests included not only the expected society matrons and gentlemen, but also what appeared to be a university professor engaged in animated discussion with a clergyman, and a woman whose practical dress marked her as being of the professional class rather than the aristocracy. "My aunt believes interesting conversation requires diverse perspectives," Hope explained. "You'll find no discussion of the weather or fashion here, unless, of course, it's the professor explaining the meteorological patterns affecting this year's growing season, or Mrs. Bennet discussing the economic impact of changing hemlines on the textile industry." Alexander smiled. A refreshing change from most drawing rooms. "I thought you might appreciate it." She guided him toward a silver-haired woman holding court near the fireplace. "Come, let me introduce you to Mrs. Bennet. She manages several charitable workhouses for women and has fascinating insights into how small policy changes can make enormous differences in outcomes." The next hour passed in conversation unlike any Alexander had experienced in London society. Mrs. Bennet indeed proved to be a font of practical knowledge about employment opportunities for women fallen on hard times. The professor, upon learning of Alexander's agricultural interests, shared recent research on crop rotation that might increase Thornfield's yields. Even the clergyman, far from offering platitudes, discussed specific community support systems his parish had implemented that had reduced dependency on poor relief. Throughout, Alexander observed Hope moving comfortably among the guests, clearly familiar with each of their areas of expertise and genuinely interested in their insights. She asked thoughtful questions and occasionally made connections between different conversations, bringing people together over shared interests. "Your niece has created quite a remarkable salon," Alexander commented to Mrs. Winslow as Hope was momentarily engaged elsewhere. The older woman smiled fondly. "Hope has her uncle's gift for bringing together minds that might not otherwise connect. James always said that innovation happens at the intersection of different fields of knowledge. A progressive view." "My brother-in-law was nothing if not progressive," Mrs. Winslow agreed. "He built his shipping empire by recognizing possibilities others missed, often by listening to those society typically ignores: sailors, dock workers, even the women who packed goods for transport." Alexander's curiosity about Hope's uncle grew. "He sounds like a remarkable man." He was. And he raised Hope to see the world through the same lens, looking for value and wisdom where others might not think to look. Mrs. Winslow's expression grew more serious. That's why she insisted on maintaining control of Winslow Shipping after his death, despite pressure to sell to his male associates. She runs the company herself. Alexander couldn't hide his surprise. With the assistance of trusted managers, yes. She makes all major decisions and reviews the books weekly. Pride colored Mrs. Winslow's voice. The company has grown by nearly 20% under her direction, despite initial resistance from some captains and business partners. Alexander glanced across the room at Hope, seeing her in a new light. He had known she was wealthy, of course, but had assumed her inheritance was managed by male relatives or trustees until she married. The revelation that she actively controlled a significant shipping company herself was extraordinary. As the gathering began to disperse, Hope approached him with a proposition. "Lord Fairmorn, if you're not otherwise engaged, I wonder if you might accompany my aunt and me to visit the children's home tomorrow? We're delivering books and supplies, and I'd value your perspective on some improvements we're considering for the building." The invitation surprised him. "I'd be honored, though I'm not sure what expertise I could offer." "You manage a large estate with numerous tenant properties," she replied. "Your practical knowledge of building maintenance and space utilization would be invaluable." Put that way, it made perfect sense, though Alexander suspected there might be more to the invitation than merely seeking his expertise on buildings. "Then I shall gladly attend," he said. "What time shall I call for you?" They arranged the details, and as Alexander took his leave, Hope walked him to the door. "I hope you found today's gathering worthwhile," she said. "More than worthwhile," he replied honestly. "It's refreshing to engage in meaningful conversation rather than social pleasantries." Her smile was warm. "I thought you might feel that way. You have a mind that seeks substance over show, I think." The observation, so simply stated yet so accurate, caught him off guard. Few in society had bothered to notice anything about him beyond his title and financial troubles lately. "As to you, Miss Winslow." He took her hand and bowed over it. "Until tomorrow." As his carriage carried him away, Alexander reflected on the afternoon. He had come to Mrs. Winslow's home still focused on Hope's fortune as Thornfield's salvation. He left thinking about her mind, her character, and her unexpected capabilities, and found himself looking forward to the morrow for reasons that had nothing to do with his estate's troubles. The children's home was a substantial brick building in a modest but respectable area of London. As Alexander helped Hope and Mrs. Winslow from their carriage, he noted the building's solid construction and well-kept exterior, signs of proper funding and management. "We support 5 such homes throughout London," Hope explained as they approached the entrance. "This one houses 38 children between the ages of 5 and 12. Inside, they were greeted by the matron, a capable-looking woman of middle years who clearly held Hope in high regard. "Miss Winslow, the children have been watching for you all morning." As if on cue, the sound of running feet echoed down the hallway, and several young children appeared, their faces brightening at the sight of Hope. To Alexander's surprise, they rushed forward without the restraint typically expected of charity recipients, and Hope knelt to embrace them without concern for her fine dress. "Miss Hope, did you bring the books you promised?" asked a small girl with red braids. "Of course I did, Emma. And some slates and chalk for your lessons too." The children noticed Alexander then, their expressions turning curious and slightly wary. Hope straightened and made the introductions. "Children, this is the Earl of Fairmorn. He's come to help us plan improvements to the East Dormitory." A bold boy of about 10 stepped forward. "Are you really an Earl, sir? With a castle and everything?" Alexander smiled. "I have a house rather than a castle, but yes, I am an Earl." "Do you have horses?" another child asked. "I do. Several." This produced murmurs of approval among the children, who proceeded to pepper him with questions until the matron gently reminded them of their morning lessons. As the children reluctantly departed, Alexander turned to Hope with newfound respect. "They clearly adore you. And this is hardly the grim institution one might expect of a charity home." "That's precisely our aim," Hope replied. "These children have already lost so much, their parents, their homes, their sense of security. We believe they deserve warmth, education, and the chance to still be children, not merely recipients of grudging charity." The matron led them on a tour of the building, explaining the current challenges with the East Dormitory, which needed significant repairs and reconfiguration to accommodate more children comfortably. Alexander found himself fully engaged in the practical discussions, offering suggestions about layout, materials, and construction approaches that might reduce costs without sacrificing quality. Hope took notes and asked insightful questions that revealed her own knowledge of building matters. "You're surprisingly well versed in construction," he commented as they examined a problematic section of ceiling. "Shipping warehouses require constant maintenance," she replied. "And my uncle believed I should understand every aspect of the business, including the properties we own." After completing their inspection and finalizing plans for the renovations, they joined the children for their midday meal, a simple but nutritious affair served in a bright dining hall. Alexander found himself seated between a solemn boy named Thomas and a chattering girl called Lucy, who seemed determined to tell him her entire life story between bites of stew. Across the table, Hope was deep in conversation with several older children, listening to their accounts of recent lessons with genuine interest. She knew each child by name, remembered details about their progress, and offered encouragement that felt personal rather than perfunctory. Watching her, Alexander felt something shift within him. The calculated interest he had initially felt toward her fortune had been gradually transforming over their meetings, but this, seeing her genuine care for these children, crystallized a new awareness. Hope Winslow was extraordinary not for her wealth, but for her heart. As they prepared to depart, the matron pulled Hope aside for a private word. Mrs. Winslow had remained at the home to oversee the unpacking of supplies, leaving Alexander and Hope to return to Belgravia together. In the privacy of the carriage, Alexander found himself speaking from the heart. "What you're doing for those children, it's remarkable." Hope looked pleased but demurred. "It's simply the right thing to do. They deserve champions. Many would agree in principle but do nothing in practice. Like many who express concern for the poor from the comfort of their drawing rooms, yet never soil their gloves with actual assistance." Her smile took any sting from the words. "I was fortunate to have an uncle who taught me that wealth is a responsibility, not merely a privilege." Alexander felt a pang of conscience. "I fear I've been too consumed with preserving Thornfield to look beyond my own concerns lately." "That's understandable," Hope replied gently. "You bear responsibility for many who depend on the estate for their livelihoods. That's no small matter." Her understanding, rather than alleviating his guilt, somehow deepened it. "Still, seeing your work today has been humbling." Hope regarded him thoughtfully. "Lord Fairmorn, please, call me Alexander," he interrupted, the formality suddenly seeming absurd after the day they had shared. Her expression softened. "Alexander, then. And you must call me Hope." She hesitated, then continued, "I've been meaning to speak with you about Thornfield's situation more directly." His heart quickened. Was this the moment she would address the unspoken courtship that had been developing between them? "I'm listening. I believe I may be able to help, but not in the way you might initially have hoped." Her expression was serious now. "I've made inquiries about the creditor who purchased your father's debt." This was not what Alexander had expected. You've been investigating my creditor? How? Why? The timing and manner of the purchase struck me as suspicious, she explained. Buying debt only to immediately demand repayment instead of collecting the interest suggests motives beyond financial return. Alexander stared at her. That's precisely what troubled my solicitor. My uncle taught me to recognize patterns in business dealings, Hope continued. This has all the hallmarks of a deliberate attempt to force Thornfield's sale to a specific buyer. But who would? Alexander broke off as a possibility occurred to him. Radcliffe. It must be Lord Radcliffe. His lands border Thornfield to the north, and he's been trying to purchase our timber tract for years. Hope nodded. That matches my findings. My sources in the financial community confirm that Lord Radcliffe has been raising substantial capital, far more than would be needed merely to purchase your debt. Alexander's mind raced. He wants Thornfield to fall into default so he can buy it at auction for less than its true value. Precisely. Hope's eyes shone with intelligence and determination. But there may be a way to prevent it. How? The debt is due in 10 days, and I've exhausted every resource I have. Not every resource, Hope replied. You haven't considered a business partnership? A partnership? Alexander repeated, confused. Winslow Shipping is expanding its agricultural exports, she explained. We need reliable suppliers of quality goods to meet our contracts with markets in the Americas and the continent. Thornfield's lands could provide exactly what we need. Alexander tried to follow her reasoning. You're suggesting a business arrangement rather than a marriage of convenience. Hope finished when he faltered. Yes. A properly structured business partnership would provide the capital you need to clear the debt, while giving Winslow Shipping preferred access to Thornfield's agricultural output. The proposal was so unexpected, yet so practical, that Alexander found himself momentarily speechless. It offered salvation for Thornfield without requiring Hope to tie herself to a man who had initially pursued her for her fortune. That's remarkably generous, he said finally. But why would you do this? Hope's gaze was direct and clear. Because it makes good business sense. Because those tenant families deserve security. And because? She hesitated, a touch of color rising to her cheeks, because I've come to care for you, Alexander. Not for your title or your land, but for the man I've come to know these past weeks, the man who offered practical building advice for an orphanage, who sat patiently listening to Lucy's endless stories, who loves his sister enough to swallow his pride and seek solutions to protect her future. The carriage had reached Mrs. Winslow's home, but neither made a move to exit. Alexander took Hope's gloved hands in his own. I began this acquaintance with mercenary intentions, he admitted. I thought only of your fortune as Thornfield's salvation. But these weeks with you have changed everything. Your kindness, your intelligence, your practical compassion, I find myself thinking of you constantly, and not because of what you could provide for my estate. Hope's eyes softened. And I feared you saw only an heiress, not a woman. I see you, Hope Winslow, he said fervently. A woman of remarkable substance, who has captured my attention, my admiration, and my heart. Then perhaps, she said with a smile that made his pulse quicken, we might consider both a business partnership and a personal one. Are you suggesting that we continue to know each other better, with honest intentions on both sides? She clarified. The business arrangement can proceed immediately to save Thornfield. The personal relationship can develop at its own pace, without financial pressure forcing hasty decisions. Alexander marveled at her wisdom. You continue to surprise me with your practical solutions to seemingly impossible problems. My uncle would say that most problems appear impossible only because we limit ourselves to conventional approaches. Her smile turned playful. And there is nothing conventional about a merchant's niece and an earl finding common ground in both business and personal matters. Indeed not. Alexander brought her hands to his lips. Though I find I care less for convention with each day in your company. Hope's eyes sparkled. Then we are agreed? A business partnership immediately, and a personal understanding to be explored further. We are agreed, Alexander replied, his heart lighter than it had been in months. Though I warn you, I already know which partnership I value more. The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Hope's solicitors worked with Alexander's to structure a business arrangement that provided immediate capital to repay Lord Radcliffe's agent, securing Thornfield's future. The partnership terms were favorable to both parties. Winslow Shipping gained reliable agricultural supplies, while Thornfield received not only financial salvation but also expanded markets for its produce. Lord Radcliffe's fury upon learning his scheme had failed became the talk of London, especially when it emerged that he had spent considerable sums arranging the debt purchase through intermediaries to hide his involvement. But the true talk of the season was the increasingly visible courtship between the Earl of Fairmorn and Miss Hope Winslow. They were seen together at every significant social event, but also in less expected venues, visiting model tenement houses, attending lectures at the Royal Society, and once, to the shock of certain society matrons, touring the Winslow Shipping docks together. For Alexander, these weeks revealed new facets of Hope's character that only deepened his admiration. Her business acumen was matched by genuine compassion for those less fortunate. Her unconventional upbringing had given her a refreshing perspective on society's rigid structures, while her intelligence made her conversation endlessly engaging. For her part, Hope discovered in Alexander a man whose sense of responsibility to his dependents matched her own, whose mind was open to new ideas despite his traditional position, and whose growing affection for her was clearly for herself rather than her fortune. On a golden afternoon in late spring, Alexander invited Hope to visit Thornfield. Though business matters had frequently taken him to the estate since their partnership began, Hope had not yet seen the ancestral home he had fought so hard to preserve. As their carriage crested the final hill, Thornfield came into view, a graceful Tudor manor house nestled among ancient oaks, with gardens stretching toward distant rolling fields. "It's beautiful," Hope said softly, taking in the scene. "It's been in my family for 14 generations," Alexander replied, watching her reaction rather than the familiar view. "Though I confess I see it differently now." "How so?" "Before, I saw only the legacy I was obligated to preserve. Now I see possibilities for the future, agricultural innovations, improved cottages for the tenants, perhaps even a school for the workers' children." He took her hand. "I find myself looking forward rather than backward." Hope's smile was warm. "Your ancestors would be proud of such vision." "Some would," he agreed. "Others would be scandalized that I've gone into trade by partnering with a shipping company." "Progress often scandalizes someone," Hope replied with a laugh. They toured the house and grounds, with Alexander proudly showing the improvements already underway thanks to their partnership. In the rose garden, Elizabeth's favorite spot, he finally gave voice to what had been in his heart for weeks. "Hope," he began, taking both her hands in his. "When I first sought your company, I saw only your fortune as Thornfield's salvation. I was prepared to offer marriage as a business transaction, my title and position in exchange for financial rescue." Her eyes were steady on his face as he continued. "What I didn't expect was to find in you a woman whose kindness, intelligence, and strength of character would transform my understanding of value itself. You've shown me that true worth lies in how we care for others, in the positive difference we make, not in titles or acres or family names." Alexander knelt on one knee, still holding her hands. "I love you, Hope Winslow. Not for what you could give me, but for who you are. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, not to save Thornfield, which you've already helped secure, but to build a future together that might make both our ancestors proud, conventional or otherwise?" Hope's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Are you certain?" "I'll always be the merchant's niece who speaks too directly and involves herself in business matters. Society may never fully accept me." "I've never been more certain of anything," Alexander replied fervently. "And any society that cannot recognize your worth is poorer for its blindness." "Then yes," Hope said, her face illuminated with joy. "Yes, I will marry you, Alexander Fairmorn, not for your title or your estate, but for the man who sat patiently listening to orphan stories and who sees possibilities where others see only traditions." He rose and drew her into his arms, their kiss sealed with the promise of a future neither could have imagined when they first met, a future built not on necessity or convention, but on mutual respect, shared purpose, and love that had grown from the most unexpected beginning into something true and lasting. When the announcement of their engagement appeared in the Gazette the following week, society gossips whispered that the Earl had sought the merchant's niece for her fortune to save his failing estate. They were partly right, of course, but none could see what both Hope and Alexander now knew with certainty, that what had begun as a calculation had been transformed by kindness, character, and understanding into a love that would endure long after gossip had found new subjects and forgotten them entirely. And at Thornfield, roses still bloomed in the garden where an earl had knelt to ask for the hand of a woman whose worth far exceeded her considerable fortune, the woman whose practical compassion and clear-eyed vision had captured not just his estate, but his heart forever.